I just spent the last 10 to 15 minutes trying to swat a fruit fly that got in my room, and I'm pretty sure I got him. So let's just hope and pray through the prayers of the holy saints that there are no more flies in my room. There are no more fruit flies in here. All right. I hope he didn't bring any friends. Yeah. On a serious note, I remember about a couple of months ago, or probably a year and some change ago, I remember I was at a Bible study at my church, and we were studying and having a conversation on the warfare between both the flesh and the spirit. And we were having a whole conversation about this. What I love about my Bible studies is like the way that it's structured. It's very, very interactive, right? Very much like, of course, like, there's a teacher that's leading, of course, there's a diakon that's leading the Bible study. But what I love about it is it's more interactive, and it's more like, us kind of like, tossing ideas out there, and, tossing like answers out there, rather than it being kind of like a okay, like a class where it's like you're given multiple choice and stuff like that. Like, no, like we actually just like, sit either in the church or around in like a circle, and we just kind of like, read together, and we just, speak about what's going on, which is pretty cool. And like, I'm pretty sure everybody has experienced this in, their own churches, own parishes, their own Bible studies. Sometimes, somebody asks a question that's unrelated to the topic that's being talked about. Um, and this young lady, I remember she had asked a question, and it was pertaining to pretty much like how Jesus is God, right? Like, or not necessarily how Jesus is God, more so, is he the only son of God? Because, mind you, she's a young, very, very young. And she was just curious because, she would read in the Old Testament how, you have the term Bnei Israel in the Old Testament, which basically can be translated either to the children of Israel or sons of Israel, right? So you have two translations, but depending on whatever Bible you read, whether it be King James, whether it be, I believe, NASB 1995 as well, or probably ESV as well, you will see that it says sons of Israel. And, her seeing that, it made her question, asked a question during the Bible study. Is Jesus the only son of God? My diakon, he gave a very, very plausible answer, very, very straightforward, plausible answer, and answered her question. And she was pretty satisfied with the answer. I often think back to this scenario, and it makes me think because there was also one time where, there was one kid during a Bible study. He had asked a pretty straightforward question, and a pretty fair question at that. I think that all of us, especially older Christians, not just in age, but also older in the faith as well, I think this is probably how a lot of youngsters feel. And the question he asked was, like, with all due respect, why is this important? Why is it important that, we, learn about, like, what our saints, say about, scripture and, things like that, like, why is it important that we, look at homilies and church fathers and learn about church history? Like, I really feel like all of this stuff is really just, for theologians. Like, why is it important that we learn this type of stuff? Remember, I had gave him an answer of, as well as my diakon. I asked my diakon if I may answer that question. And I answered this question like, well, the church is the pillar and grounds and foundation of the truth. And on top of that, the church is the one that's preserved the Bible and has been tasked with safeguarding the Bible, as well as telling you what scripture is and what it isn't, what it means and what it doesn't. And so it is important to know the history of your church because it's a lot like learning the language of your church. And when I say the language, I mean like, learning the the yeses and the nos, the yays and the nays, if that makes sense. Like, okay, is this how we describe Christ's nature? Is this not how we describe Christ's nature? What do we believe about the sacraments? What do we believe about baptism? What do we believe about salvation? How do we believe that Christ redeemed the world? What exactly happened on the cross? All of this stuff, right? Who is Christ's mother, the Theotokos, right? Like, who, like, all of that stuff, right? I think his question was a very fair question, and I think a lot of youngsters nowadays, like, they feel. in a way, especially in an age of information and technology where all of it is like very, very accessible. It's like kind of like nothing stopping you. Well, maybe except the paywall and the subscription, but you know. I'm pretty sure there are a lot of youngsters who probably do have these questions of like, why is this stuff important? Why is this, why is it important that I learn church history? Especially if I just have the Bible at my disposal. And it really makes me question sometimes. I'm not a diakon or a teacher in any shape or form. But oftentimes, I do put myself in the shoes of a diakon, and oftentimes, like, just in passing, think, like, oh, like, what is a way that, church history and theology could be, like, what's a way to help younger folks, around my age or younger, what is a way to help them understand that like this stuff isn't for guys in fancy suits and with college degrees, like it's not just limited to those people who dedicate their lives to studying this stuff. I think Diakon Meret actually put it best, right? Theology is not for, or not just limited and for the aristocrats. The stuff is for you too as a layman. If you do have a desire to, like, explore the faith, learn more about the faith, and go deeper into, what exactly it is that whatever it is that you would love to know. And oftentimes the answer sometimes sounds a little bit like, at least the answer that I give myself is oftentimes like, oh, I think like they just have to have a interest for this stuff. Like it's more so like they have to have an interest in it. Like you can't really force anybody to want to learn about this stuff. At the same time, I'm like, but then like, but how do we spark that? Like, how do we spark that interest? Because like I'm pretty sure like there are a lot of folks who grow up in Orthodoxy, and this is based off of interactions that I've had with folks who are within my church, outside of, my church, and within other churches and parishes. It honestly, takes them by surprise and shocks them that I'm somebody who just loves to learn about this stuff and has learned like a lot. And I'm not even tooting my own horn when I say that. Like I'm just like, and it's really just because like I'm so inquisitive, dude. Like I'm not even learning this stuff to like be like, oh, look at me, look how smart I am, look how much I know. Like no, I just love to learn this stuff because it's so rich. And I know because I come from something that has no answers for what it believes and what it has to say about scripture whatsoever. I oftentimes, want to share this stuff with people, but at the same time, it's like, all right, I do put myself in the shoes of a diakon or a teacher, and sometimes, like, ask myself, like, how exactly is it that if I were to speak to somebody who's younger than me about this stuff, like, how do I get them interested, or how do I, help them to, want to learn about this stuff? And not saying they got to become a theologian, but like, how do I get them to understand that, like, yo, do you understand what you're doing? Like, do you understand what you're participating in? Do you understand why you do this? Or are you just kind of like going through the motions? Sometimes the answer sounds like, oh, that just seems like something that they have to personally like have, or something like a personal like spark that they have to have ignited within themselves. Or shoot, maybe sometimes it does come in the form of, you know, how my Bible studies are structured at my church, right? We sit around a room and, we let people ask questions, just throw out their curiosity out there and, have them ask questions about whatever it is that they have questions about. Sometimes that's a question I ask myself. What is a way to help the youth understand that theology is for you too? It's not for guys in suits with a theology degree and stuff like that. And it's not just for folks who dedicate their lives to studying this stuff, but what is a way to let them know, like, hey, your ancestors, your church fathers, your saints, they left this for you. They want you to learn about this stuff. They want you to understand this stuff so that you can grow your appreciation and possibly either have the same level or have a level of appreciation that far exceeds theirs. All of it is really just to, really just to help people understand the love of Christ, the beauty of who Christ is. And so it's like, when it comes to things like theology, it's like, all right, how do we help people? How do we help youngsters understand that?
Must